When we're using the Select by Normal tool in its default contiguous selection mode, we can change the way that it grows the selection. Rather than comparing the angle of adjacent components, we can right-click on the Select by Normal button and choose to use the static reference normal. Now when I click on one of these primitives on this side of the wall, we see that the selection doesn't flow around a radius corner to the other end of the wall, and that's because rather than comparing the normal of each adjacent primitive, Houdini is now growing the selection by comparing the normal of each primitive to the normal of the primitive which I clicked on. The normal of the primitive we click on becomes the static reference normal, and this is what the normal of every other primitive gets compared to. Houdini continues to grow the selection until it reaches a primitive which is angled further away from the primitive we clicked on than the spread angle. This mode can be useful for selecting specific areas of curved surfaces. For example, if I come over to this tall building here, at the top there are these domed objects, and maybe we want to reshape these cap elements and push them back in towards the bases so they don't stick out as far. So what I want to do is select all the points or edges or primitives of this domed part, but none of the side or the base components. And then once I've made that selection, I can simply transform it to shorten the side segments and push the domed caps in towards the side of the building. Now selecting the primitives of the domed cap using the Select by Normal node isn't going to work that well, because we don't have a primitive at the very apex of the dome. We have a point at the apex which is surrounded by these four primitives, and each of these primitives is angled out away from the apex. So if I set my spread angle to just below 90 degrees, so let's say 85 degrees, to try and select all the primitives of the domed cap, but not the sides, then now as I click on these primitives surrounding this point at the apex, we see that we get an off-center selection. Whichever of these four primitives closest to the apex I click on, I select some of the sides, but not all of the domed cap. So primitive selection is not going to work in this case, but the Select by Normal mode works in just the same way for selecting points and edges as it does for selecting primitives. So I can switch to point selection, and now if I click on the point at the apex of the dome, we see that we select all the points of the dome cap apart from this last loop. The normal of each of these selected points is within 85 degrees of the normal of this point at the apex. We get an even symmetrical selection of points because the normal direction of this point at the very apex is pointing straight out away from the cap without any bias to one side or another. This will be a bit easier to see if I turn on the vertex normal markers. And we can see that on this domed part of the mesh, the vertex normals are all pointing in the same direction as the point normal. And these normal markers just help us visualize the angle between the normal of the point which I clicked on at the very apex of the dome and each of the other points on the cap. And we can see how the normal of each of these points is within 85 degrees of the point which I clicked on. If I just disable the Use Static Reference Normal option so that we can compare the behavior, then now when I click on this point at the apex again, we see that all the points on the entire piece of connected geometry get selected. And this is because the tool's now measuring the angle between the normal of each adjacent point, rather than comparing the normal of each point with the point which I clicked on. So I'll re-enable the Use Static Reference Normal option, and I'll reselect these points, and now I can hold down the Shift key and click on the point at the apex of each of these other domes to also select these. Finally, I'll grow the selection by tapping Shift G to also include this last loop of points on each dome, and now I'll tap the T key to switch to the Move tool, and I'll move these in towards the building. So the Select by Static Reference Normal modes made it quick and easy to select the points on the dome parts of these meshes, and it can also be useful for selecting faces and bevels at the same time. For example, a little lower down on this same building, we've got this series of panels which look a bit as though they could be access hatches or possibly end caps for something. And let's say that we want to extend the center part of these so that they protrude further out away from the face of the building. So what I want to do is select all the points or edges or primitives on the front face of the large central panel of each of these, and also the bevels up to the point where they meet this side loop of primitives. So I'll click on one of these points on the front, and the spread angle of 85 degrees selects just the points on the front facing panel and the bevel. And in this case we could also select edges or primitives in the same way. So if I tap the 3 key to switch to edge selection mode, and click on one of these edges on the front of the panel, that selects just the edges of the front panel and the bevel. And if I switch to primitive selection and click on one of these primitives on the front, that selects the primitives on the front panel and bevel. A spread angle of 85 degrees works because these primitives running around the sides are at 90 degrees to the front-facing primitive which I clicked on, and so the selection stops being grown at the point where it meets these side primitives. So now I can hold down the Shift key, and I can quickly make the same selection on all of these access hatch elements. Now I can tap the T key to switch to the Move tool, and I'll move these out away from the building. So in this lesson, we've seen how we can select a contiguous area of components using a static reference normal, rather than using the adjacent component normals.